The Galactic Empire had always prided itself on its invulnerability. Spanning across 1,000 systems, its warships glided like unyielding titans through the stars, their weaponry unmatched and their rule unchallenged. Beneath the cold, mechanical glow of its star-dominating fleets, there was a quiet arrogance that permeated the highest echelons of power. Emperor Talaris, a figure of awe and fear, had long been the symbol of this dominance, his throne forged in the crucible of victory. For centuries, no one had dared question the might of the Empire, and no one would dare now. Or so they thought. On the fringes of the Empire's reach, nestled in the dark void of an unremarkable system, a spark of rebellion was quietly kindling. The planet Eryx, a dusty world of vast deserts and crumbling ruins, had long been ignored by the Empire. Its inhabitants were simple, resourceful, and mostly isolated from the galactic powers that shaped their fate. It was a place forgotten by history, where the hum of starships rarely reached, and the distant whispers of empire came as faint echoes on the windswept plains. But even in the arid wasteland, something was stirring, something that would soon challenge the Empire in ways they could never have imagined. Commander Nessa Karan, leader of the insurgents, stood at the edge of a makeshift command post, staring out at the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the jagged mountains in the distance. Her fingers brushed lightly against the cold steel of a relic, a machine that had no place in a galaxy brimming with energy beams and plasma fields, a Gatling gun. It was an anachronism, a weapon that belonged to a bygone age. To the Empire, it was little more than an antique, a symbol of a time when war was fought with blood and brass rather than lasers and technology. But to Nessa, it was hope. It was the tool that could turn the tide. You still have faith in that thing? The voice behind her was sharp and skeptical. It belonged to Lieutenant Marcus, a former Imperial soldier who had defected after witnessing the Empire's brutality firsthand. He was a good man, loyal to the cause, but like many others in the rebellion, he could not fully understand the power of old things. I've seen the Empire's arsenal. Their fleets, their drones, their ground forces. This thing won't stand a chance. Nessa didn't turn around. She knew the skepticism in his voice was not just about the gun, but about the entire fight. The rebellion was small, ragtag even. They had no fleet, no advanced technology, only the will to survive and the courage to stand against a colossus. The Empire could wipe them out with a single wave of its hand. But Nessa had seen something others hadn't. She had seen what it meant to fight with the heart of the past. I've seen it work, Nessa replied quietly. Her voice was firm, but it carried the weight of years of hardship and resolve. We can't fight them with their weapons, Marcus. We fight with what we have. And this is what we have. She knew the Empire would come. The message had been clear in the intercepted transmissions. The fleet was en route to Eryx, a demonstration of their might, a swift suppression of what they saw as a fleeting annoyance. But the Empire had underestimated one thing: the resilience of those they deemed insignificant. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness, and Nessa turned to see Dax, a mechanic-turned-fighter, approaching with a purposeful gait. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, his clothes torn from hours of labor. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and grinned, the look in his eyes full of determination. "It's ready," Dax said, a hint of pride in his voice. "The modifications are in place. She's got a bit more firepower now. The recoil's a beast, but we can handle it." Nessa's eyes flicked to the Gatling gun, its dark metal gleaming in the fading light. Dax had done the impossible, enhancing the ancient machine with the crude tools at his disposal. While the Empire fielded plasma cannons that could reduce a city to dust in moments, the rebellion had nothing but muscle and ingenuity. But Dax's hands were skilled, and in the midst of the chaos, he had transformed the old gun into something far more deadly. It wasn't the firepower that made the difference, though. It was the unpredictability, the sheer brutality of the weapon. The Empire would never expect it, and in that, they would falter. "You sure about this, Nessa?" Dax asked, his grin fading slightly. "We're talking about a full-scale assault. Their fleet will be on us before we can even get close." Nessa met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "We'll get close?" Before Dax could respond, the loud roar of engines echoed across the plains. The ground trembled, and dust swirled into the air as the first wave of the Empire's fleet began its descent. Their ships were massive, casting long shadows over the desert as they approached, their weapons primed for devastation. The sight of the Imperial force sent a ripple of tension through the rebellion. The soldiers gathered in the command post, hands gripping weapons that they had no faith in. They were ready to die for their freedom, but fear still lingered at the edges of their resolve. Nessa turned to face her troops. They were a scattered group, farmers, former soldiers, outcasts, and yet in that moment they were united. She could see it in their eyes, a quiet determination, a belief that they could win. The Empire had mocked them, underestimated them, and now they were ready to show that they would not go quietly into the night. "Today, we fight not with the weapons of the Empire, but with the weapons of the past," Nessa said, her voice carrying across the tense air. "The Empire may have the firepower, but we have something they can't understand. We have heart, and we will use it." A cheer rippled through the group, but it was the sound of a lone Gatling gun being loaded, its gears clicking into place, that truly filled the air with an electric charge. The battle was about to begin, and the Empire was about to learn that sometimes the old ways were more powerful than the newest inventions. As the first wave of Imperial soldiers hit the ground, the Gatling gun roared to life. The first shot tore into the air, and the sound of gunfire began to echo across the plain. The insurgents on Eryx had no illusions about their chances. They were under no delusion of victory, no fantasy of some divine intervention. They were simply fighters, working with the scraps they had, refusing to bow to the Empire's crushing superiority. On this desert planet, where the sun beat down relentlessly, where every resource had to be scraped from the earth, there was no room for weakness. The only thing that mattered was the will to keep fighting. And as long as the Gatling gun could spit its fire, they would fight. Nessa stood in the heart of the makeshift camp, her boots sinking slightly into the sand as the wind swept across the barren landscape. The rebellion was small, its numbers dwindling as each day passed. The Imperial fleet's arrival was a harbinger of the end, but Nessa had always known this moment would come. The question was never about whether they could win. It was about whether they could make the Empire pay. They had one shot at this, and they would make it count. "Is everything set?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the camp. Dax, the mechanic, was crouched over a set of old communication equipment, his hands moving deftly as he made last-minute adjustments. He had grown into something of a quiet leader, not out of choice but necessity. His expertise in the ancient tech they relied on had made him indispensable. And though he had once been an outsider, now, among the rebels, he had found a place where his skills were as valued as his grit. "We're good," Dax muttered, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his brow. "The modifications are solid. We've got a few issues with the targeting system, but nothing we can't handle." "You sure?" Nessa asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the distant silhouettes of Imperial transports could be seen descending in the sky. "The first wave would land soon." "As sure as I can be," Dax replied, standing up and giving a nod to the small team gathered around the base of the gun. "We're using every scrap we've got, and if the gun jams, we'll fix it on the fly." Nessa appreciated the honesty, but in her heart, she knew there was only so much they could do. The Empire would bring firepower so vast, so overwhelming, it was almost laughable. Yet here they were, clinging to the hope that an ancient weapon, one that most thought obsolete, could stand against the tide. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Marcus, who had been pacing near the edge of the camp. He approached, his face grim. "They're landing?" Nessa nodded, her posture straightening. She had expected this moment, but the weight of it still felt like a weight on her chest. The Empire had underestimated them. They always did. The fleet would land, their ground forces would march, and they would wipe the rebellion off the face of the planet, just as they had done countless times before. But this time, they would make them pay. The first explosion cracked the air, distant but unmistakable. Nessa's heart skipped a beat, and she turned sharply to face Dax, who was already moving toward the gun. The rebel forces sprang into action, soldiers grabbing their rifles, their blasters, and positioning themselves in whatever cover they could find. There was no time for hesitation. The battle had begun. "Ready the gun!" Nessa shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She moved to the side as Dax quickly took his place behind the Gatling gun, a massive weapon that was now positioned on a makeshift mount in the middle of the camp. It looked archaic, its large, rotating barrels gleaming under the harsh sunlight, its design a far cry from the sleek, futuristic weapons of the Empire. But in that moment, it was the only thing they had. Dax pulled the lever to start the mechanism. The old machine clicked and whirred, its gears turning with a sound that felt almost like a challenge. The roar of the Empire's landing ships grew louder, drowning out everything else. The rebels braced themselves. A series of shuddering blasts sounded off in the distance as the first Imperial dropships released their cargo. Ground troops in their heavy armor and advanced exosuits poured out, marching with military precision. They advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat, their energy rifles aimed and ready, drones flying overhead to scout and strike. "Hold steady," Nessa murmured to her troops, her eyes narrowed as she watched the advancing Empire forces. It felt like an eternity in the moment, every footstep of the enemy soldiers echoing with the certainty of their superiority. But Nessa was resolute. They had one chance, one opening, and it was the gun that would give them that edge. "Targeting locked," Dax called from behind the gun, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Firing in 3, 2. The Gatling gun erupted to life. The sound was deafening, a machine unleashed from another time, a rapid-fire storm of lead that tore through the air. The first round screamed through the sky and slammed into the ranks of the Empire's soldiers. The force of it tore into their armor, ripping through the metal and flesh beneath. It was not the clean, precise fire of a plasma beam, but the brutal, indiscriminate power of bullets, old, crude, and terrifyingly effective. The Empire troops stumbled, their coordinated assault faltering for the first time. They had expected to crush the rebels effortlessly. Instead, they were met with a hail of bullets that cut through their formation, tearing apart their precision like paper in a storm. The drones above them buzzed frantically, trying to recalibrate their targeting, but the sheer volume of fire from the Gatling gun kept them disoriented. Nessa saw the first wave falter, their formation breaking as they tried to regroup. The sound of the Gatling gun's rapid fire was a savage pulse in the chaos, a reminder that the rebels would not go down without a fight. But even as their enemies reeled, the Empire's response was swift. Heavy artillery began to fire, bright bursts of energy that illuminated the desert like stars exploding. The ground shook beneath their feet as the first of the counterattacks hit. Nessa's heart raced. They hadn't anticipated this much resistance so quickly. "We're going to need more time," Dax shouted over the gunfire, sweat pouring down his face as he worked to keep the Gatling gun firing. "Hold them off," Nessa ordered, her voice calm despite the rising tension. "We'll make it count." As the Imperial forces began to adjust, bringing heavier weapons to bear, Nessa knew they had only moments to make a difference. She could see the tide beginning to shift. The gun could hold the line for a little while longer, but the real test was still ahead. Would it be enough? Would their fight, even against all odds, be enough to force the Empire to reconsider their might? The answer, for now, would have to come from the gun, and the will of those who stood behind it. The Imperial commander, General Veclin, stood on the bridge of the primary landing vessel, his hands clasped behind his back. The polished chrome of his uniform gleamed under the harsh lights of the control room, a reflection of the unrelenting discipline that defined the Empire. Below him, the barren expanse of Eric's stretched endlessly, broken only by the glint of the rebellion's crude encampment. Veclin's lip curled in disdain as he watched the feed from the ground troops, their sleek exosuits advancing with mechanical precision toward the enemy position. "Pathetic," he muttered, more to himself than to the officers around him. They cling to relics and refuse to accept their place. A quick strike, and this rebellion will be nothing more than ash in the wind. The officer nearest him, Lieutenant Saris, nodded dutifully. She was younger, eager to please, and entirely confident in the Empire's superiority. Their resistance is laughable, sir. Primitive weapons, limited numbers, they'll be eradicated within the hour. Veclan allowed himself a faint smile, savoring the anticipation of the coming victory. But the smile froze when an alert flashed across the main display. The live feed from the front lines showed something unexpected: chaos. Soldiers were breaking formation, some stumbling and falling, others retreating outright. The steady advance that should have crushed the rebels in moments had stalled. "Magnify that," Veclan ordered, his voice sharp. The image shifted, zooming in on the source of the disruption. A massive, rotating weapon was tearing into the Imperial ranks, spewing an unrelenting storm of bullets. The soldiers' advanced armor, designed to withstand energy-based attacks, crumpled under the onslaught of kinetic projectiles. The gun's thunderous roar echoed through the feed, drowning out the panicked shouts of the Empire's elite troops. "What is that?" Saris asked, her voice faltering for the first time. Veclan's jaw tightened as he studied the scene. He recognized the weapon, an ancient Gatling gun, a relic from centuries past. It was laughable in its simplicity, outdated by millennia of technological advancement. Yet there it was, carving a swath through the Empire's finest soldiers like a scythe through wheat. "It's an antique," Veclan growled. "Crude, inefficient. This shouldn't be happening." The feed showed more soldiers falling, their attempts to regroup thwarted by the relentless barrage. The Gatling gun wasn't just holding the line, it was turning the tide of the battle. Veclan's confidence wavered, replaced by a simmering anger. "Deploy the drones," he barked. "Target that weapon and eliminate it immediately." On the ground, Nessa watched as the first wave of drones descended from the sky, their sleek frames glinting like deadly insects in the sunlight. She had expected this. The Empire's response was always the same: overwhelming force, an attempt to crush resistance through sheer power. But she also knew their arrogance would blind them. They wouldn't expect the rebels to fight back with such determination or ingenuity. "Dax," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Drones incoming." "I see them," Dax replied, his hands a blur as he worked to keep the Gatling gun operational. The ancient weapon's barrels were glowing red-hot, smoke rising from its overworked mechanisms. But it kept firing, a relentless torrent of destruction that forced the advancing soldiers to scatter. The first drone swooped low, its targeting systems locking onto the gun. A burst of plasma shot forth, searing the air just inches away from Dax's position. He ducked, cursing under his breath as the heat singed his arm. "Cover me," he yelled, gesturing toward Marcus, who was already moving to provide support. Marcus raised his rifle, an outdated projectile weapon that had seen better days, and fired at the drone. The first shot missed, but the second found its mark, striking the drone's propulsion system. It spiraled out of control, crashing into the ground with a satisfying explosion. "Nice shot," Dax called, grinning despite the tension. "Don't get too comfortable," Marcus replied, his voice grim. "There's plenty more where that came from." Nessa's eyes darted across the battlefield, assessing the situation. The Gatling gun was holding its own, but the drones were relentless, and the Empire's soldiers were beginning to regroup. They were adapting, finding ways to exploit the gun's limited mobility and reliance on manual operation. "We need to move the gun," Nessa said, her mind racing. "If we stay here, we're done." Dax looked up from his position, his face pale with exhaustion. "Move it where? It's not exactly built for mobility." "Figure it out," Nessa snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We can't let them pin us down." As if on cue, another wave of drones descended, their plasma cannons firing in coordinated bursts. The rebels scattered, some taking cover behind the crude barricades that had been hastily constructed, others returning fire with whatever weapons they had. "Get it ready," Nessa shouted, her voice rising above the din of battle. Dax gritted his teeth and began disassembling the gun's mount, his hands moving with practiced precision. Marcus and another rebel covered him, their rifles barking as they held the drones at bay. In the control room aboard the Imperial vessel, Veclan watched the scene unfold with mounting frustration. The rebellion should have been crushed by now, their primitive weapons rendered useless against the Empire's technological superiority. Instead, his forces were faltering, their confidence shaken by the sheer brutality of the Gatling gun's fire. "Commander," Sarah said hesitantly, "should we deploy additional reinforcements?" Veclan's eyes narrowed, his pride warring with the practical need to ensure victory. He could not allow this setback to tarnish the Empire's reputation. "Send in the heavy artillery," he said coldly. "I want that weapon destroyed. No more mistakes." On the ground, the rebels were preparing to move, their movements hurried but efficient. The Gatling gun, now partially disassembled, was being loaded onto a makeshift transport. Nessa stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes fixed on the advancing Imperial forces. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Almost," Dax replied, his hands never stopping. "Good," Nessa said. She turned to Marcus, her gaze firm. "We hold them here as long as we can. Then we move. If we're going down, we're taking as many of them with us as possible." The sound of heavy artillery in the distance signaled the Empire's next move. The battle was far from over, but as the Gatling gun roared one final time before its temporary retreat, Nessa felt a flicker of hope. They had made the Empire bleed, and they weren't done yet. The transport rattled violently as it sped across the desert, a rough patch of metal welded together by desperate hands. Nessa gripped the side, her knuckles white, as the Gatling gun, now bolted to the vehicle's frame, rumbled with every bump and jolt. The wind roared past them, carrying the acrid scent of burning machinery and scorched earth. Behind them, the Imperial forces were regrouping, their precision machines cutting through the chaos with merciless efficiency. Dax was crouched by the gun, his eyes darting between its controls and the oncoming horizon. His grease-streaked hands moved frantically, tightening bolts and adjusting dials as if the weapon's very survival depended on it. In truth, it probably did. The Gatling gun was ancient, a relic that had no right to stand against the might of Imperial technology. And yet, it had become their symbol of defiance, a weapon that roared in the face of annihilation. "They're gaining on us," Marcus called from the front of the transport, his voice barely audible over the engine's sputtering roar. He was scanning the rear with binoculars, his jaw tight. "Dropships incoming, 3 no, 4 of them," Nessa swore under her breath. They had bought themselves time with the last skirmish, but it hadn't been enough. The Empire's response was swift and brutal, as always. Their pursuers were closing in, and the rebels had nowhere to hide. "Dax," she shouted, "can the gun fire while we're moving?" Dax hesitated, his fingers pausing mid-adjustment. "Technically, yes. Practically, it might tear this whole transport apart." "Do it anyway," Nessa ordered, her voice cutting through any protest. "If they catch us, it won't matter how intact we are." Dax nodded grimly, his hands moving once more. He flipped a series of switches, the Gatling gun groaning to life with a metallic whine that sent vibrations through the vehicle. The barrels began to spin, a low, menacing hum that promised destruction. "Ready!" Dax yelled. Nessa turned to Marcus. "Aim for their engines. We need to slow them down." Marcus moved quickly, taking his position near the gun. The rebels had few resources, but they had sharp eyes and steadier hands than the Empire gave them credit for. The first dropship was already in range, its sleek, ominous shape casting a shadow over the dunes. The Gatling gun roared to life. Bullets tore through the air, a relentless storm that pounded into the dropship's hull. The vehicle shuddered under the recoil, but the gun held steady, its ancient mechanisms defying every expectation. Sparks erupted as the rounds found their mark, ripping into the dropship's engine housing. "Direct hit!" Marcus shouted, his voice tinged with exhilaration. The dropship wavered, its propulsion system stuttering. It veered off course, slamming into the desert floor in a cloud of dust and flame. A cheer erupted from the rebels on the transport, but Nessa didn't allow herself the luxury of celebration. There were still 3 more dropships, and the ground forces weren't far behind. "Keep firing," she commanded. The second dropship maneuvered to avoid the gunfire, its advanced targeting systems locking onto the rebels' transport. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, each one a deadly shot that narrowly missed its mark. The transport lurched as Marcus fired again, his rounds grazing the dropship's hull, but failing to do significant damage. "They're adapting," Dax muttered, his voice tight. "Then we adapt faster," Nessa replied, her eyes sharp. She turned to the driver, a wiry young rebel named Layla. "Head for the canyon. We'll use the terrain." Layla nodded, her hands gripping the wheel as she veered sharply to the right. The transport careened toward the canyon, its tires kicking up a cloud of sand behind it. The dropships followed, their engines roaring as they closed the distance. The canyon loomed ahead, its jagged walls casting long shadows in the fading light. It was a risky move, one wrong turn, and they'd crash. But the narrow passages would limit the dropship's maneuverability, giving the rebels a chance to level the playing field. As the transport entered the canyon, the dropship slowed, their pilots forced to navigate carefully. The Gatling gun fired again, its rounds ricocheting off the rock walls and striking one of the pursuing ships. This time, the damage was catastrophic. The dropship spiraled out of control, slamming into the canyon wall in a fiery explosion. "Two down," Marcus called, his voice triumphant. Nessa allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The remaining dropships were closing in, their weapons trained on the transport. Plasma fire rained down, forcing the rebels to duck as the canyon walls echoed with the sound of destruction. "We can't keep this up," Dax shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Nessa knew he was right. The Gatling gun was overheating, its barrels glowing with the strain of continuous fire. The transport was struggling, its engine groaning under the pressure, and the Empire's forces were relentless. But then, an idea sparked in her mind. Risky, desperate, but perhaps their only chance. "Layla, take us to the narrowest point in the canyon," Nessa ordered. "What?" Layla replied, glancing back at her in disbelief. "Just do it." Layla hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. She gritted her teeth and pushed the transport harder, its wheels skidding on the rocky terrain. The canyon walls closed in around them, the space growing tighter with every second. "Marcus, Dax," Nessa said, her voice low but firm. "When we get there, we'll detonate the charges." Marcus's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "It's the only way," Nessa replied. "We bring the canyon down on them. They won't see it coming." Dax exchanged a glance with Marcus, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." The transport skidded to a halt at the narrowest point of the canyon, the rebels scrambling to position the charges they had scavenged from Imperial supplies. The dropships were almost upon them, their engines screaming as they prepared to strike. "Now!" Nessa shouted. The charges detonated, the explosion ripping through the canyon with deafening force. The walls trembled, then collapsed, a massive wave of rock and dust burying the pursuing dropships. The rebels shielded themselves from the debris, their ears ringing from the blast. When the dust settled, the canyon was silent. The Empire's forces were cut off, their pursuit halted by the rubble. For the first time in hours, Nessa allowed herself to breathe. They had survived, but she knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would regroup, and the battle would continue. Still, for now, they had won a small victory, and in the face of overwhelming odds, that was enough. The world beyond the collapsed canyon was deceptively calm. The rebels' transport limped along the edge of a dry riverbed, its battered frame creaking under the strain of the escape. Smoke still curled from the overheated Gatling gun, its barrels cooling as Dax worked to ensure it would survive another battle. The rebels aboard were silent, each one haunted by the echoes of the explosion that had sealed their pursuers behind a mountain of rubble. Nessa sat at the edge of the transport, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sky was streaked with the orange hues of twilight, and the barren expanse of Eric's stretched endlessly ahead. Every fiber of her being screamed for rest, but she knew the Empire wouldn't stop. They would regroup, adapt, and come for them again, armed with more firepower and an even greater resolve to crush the rebellion. Marcus approached her, his footsteps heavy on the metal floor. He sat beside her, the faint smell of gunpowder clinging to his clothes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the day's events pressing down like a physical burden. "We bought ourselves some time," Marcus said finally, his voice low. "But it won't be long before they dig through the canyon." Nessa nodded, her gaze distant. "Time is all we've ever bought. The question is, how do we use it?" "Surviving would be a start," Marcus replied, his tone laced with dry humor. "But we both know that's not enough." "Not anymore." She turned to him, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. The Gatling gun held them off. It turned the tide, even if just for a moment. If we can hold on to that advantage, if we can find a way to hit them harder, they won't be able to ignore us anymore. Marcus hesitated, his expression conflicted. "That gun won't last forever, Nessa. And even if it did, it's not enough to win a war." "Then we'll make it enough," she said firmly. "We don't have their technology or their numbers, but we have something they don't. We have people willing to fight for something real. And we have the element of surprise. They underestimate us. That's their weakness, and we'll exploit it." Before Marcus could respond, a sharp whistle from the front of the transport cut through their conversation. Layla, still at the wheel, gestured toward the horizon. "Something's up ahead," she called. Nessa and Marcus exchanged a look before moving toward the front. The entire transport seemed to hold its breath as they strained to see what lay in the distance. A plume of dust rose on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. It was moving toward them. Recon patrol? Marcus guessed, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm at his belt. "Could be," Nessa said. Her mind raced, calculating their odds. "But if it's the Empire, we can't afford another fight." "Not now." The rebels scrambled into action, their fatigue forgotten as they prepared for another potential confrontation. Dax checked the Gatling gun's ammo feed, muttering curses under his breath as he worked. Marcus distributed what little ammunition they had left, his expression grim. And Nessa climbed onto the transport's roof, her binoculars trained on the approaching dust cloud. As it drew closer, the shape of the vehicles became clear. They weren't Imperial dropships or armored transports. They were smaller, rougher, and far less uniform. Patchwork machines that looked as though they had been cobbled together from scrap. Nessa's pulse quickened. These weren't Imperial forces. "It's not them," she called down to the others. "But stay ready, just in case." The vehicles approached cautiously, their engines growling as they drew to a halt a few dozen meters away. The rebels on the transport tensed, their weapons raised, but not fired. A figure emerged from the lead vehicle, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to fight," the figure called, their voice carrying over the desert wind. "We heard about what you did back there. Figured you might need some help." Nessa slid off the roof of the transport, landing lightly on her feet. She signaled for the others to hold their fire before stepping forward. The figure approached, their face coming into view as they pulled down a scarf to reveal a weathered but determined expression. Their clothes were a mix of scavenged armor and worn fabric, the mark of someone who had been surviving on the fringes for a long time. "Who are you?" Nessa asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. "Name's Callan," the figure replied. "Leader of a little resistance group out west. We've been fighting the Empire in our own way, small raids, sabotage, that kind of thing. But after what you pulled, we figured it's time we stop working alone." Nessa studied Callan for a moment, her instincts probing for any hint of deception. But there was no malice in their eyes, only a hardened determination that mirrored her own. She extended a hand. "Nessa," she said, "if you're serious about fighting back, we could use all the help we can get." Callan clasped her hand firmly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of their mouth. "Good. Because we've got supplies, weapons, and a lot of people who are tired of living under the Empire's boot." As Callan's group unloaded their vehicles, bringing out crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and food, a ripple of hope spread through the rebels. For the first time in what felt like years, they weren't alone. The rebellion was no longer a scattered collection of isolated cells. It was becoming something bigger, something stronger. Nessa watched as her people worked alongside Callan's, the two groups blending seamlessly. Dax was already examining a cache of explosives with a gleam in his eye, while Marcus and Callan discussed potential targets for their next strike. The atmosphere buzzed with a newfound energy, a sense that they might actually stand a chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Nessa allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was still perilous, and the Empire's retaliation would be swift and merciless. But for the first time, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope! The Gatling gun loomed behind her, its battered frame a testament to their defiance. And as the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Nessa knew they were just getting started. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the camp in a pale, golden glow. The night had been restless, filled with whispered strategies, hurried repairs, and the faint hum of anticipation. Nessa sat cross-legged by the Gatling gun, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings etched into its surface. Each groove told a story of battle and survival, a legacy of defiance that now rested in her hands. The camp was waking slowly. Rebels from both groups moved with quiet purpose, their exhaustion overshadowed by a shared determination. Callan approached, their boots crunching softly on the sand. They carried a worn datapad, its screen flickering faintly with maps and reports. "Morning," Callan said, their tone brisk but not unkind. "We've been going over potential targets. The Empire has a supply depot about 60 clicks from here. Heavily guarded, but nothing we can't handle if we move fast." Nessa glanced at the datapad, her mind already mapping out the risks. "What's the catch?" Callan smirked faintly. "You don't trust easily, do you?" "Trust gets you killed," Nessa replied. "But tell me anyway." "The depot isn't just a storage site. It's a research hub. The Empire's been working on something new, weaponry, maybe, or upgrades for their machines. Whatever it is, they're keeping it under wraps. We hit that, and we're not just crippling their supply lines. We're sending a message." Nessa's brow furrowed. The plan was bold, almost reckless, but she couldn't deny its potential impact. A victory like that could shift the tide, even if only temporarily. She stood, brushing dust from her hands. "All right," she said. "We'll hit it. But we need to be smart about this. No unnecessary risks." Callan nodded. "Agreed. We'll split into 2 teams. Your people handle the main assault with the Gatling gun. Mine will infiltrate the depot and plant charges. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." The plan came together quickly. Dax worked tirelessly to fine-tune the Gatling gun, his hands moving with a precision born of desperation. Marcus organized the fighters, his calm authority a steadying presence. The rebels moved with the efficiency of people who had nothing left to lose, their actions driven by a shared purpose that transcended fear. By mid-morning, the convoy was on the move. The battered transport led the way, the Gatling gun mounted prominently on its frame. The desert stretched endlessly around them, its vast emptiness both a shield and a reminder of their isolation. The tension was palpable, every jolt of the transport's frame a reminder of the battle to come. As they neared the depot, the terrain began to shift. Rolling dunes gave way to jagged rock formations, the landscape scarred by the Empire's relentless expansion. The depot came into view, a sprawling complex of steel and concrete surrounded by high walls and automated defenses. Imperial patrols moved with clockwork precision, their gleaming armor a stark contrast to the rebels' worn gear. Nessa signaled for the convoy to halt, the vehicles grinding to a stop behind a ridge. The rebels disembarked, their movements swift and silent. Callan's team melted into the shadows, their figures disappearing into the labyrinth of rock that surrounded the depot. Nessa took a deep breath, her hands steadying herself on the transport side. "Dax, Marcus," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is it. We hit hard and fast. No hesitation." Dax gave her a quick thumbs up, his face streaked with grease but resolute. Marcus simply nodded, his expression grim. The Gatling gun hummed to life, its barrels spinning in anticipation. The first shots rang out like thunder, shattering the stillness of the desert. The Gatling gun unleashed a torrent of fire, its rounds tearing through the depot's outer defenses with devastating precision. Alarms blared, and Imperial forces scrambled to respond, their movements frantic in the face of the unexpected assault. Nessa's team pressed forward, using the gun's suppressive fire to cover their advance. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the rebels surged toward the depot, their battle cries a defiant roar against the Empire's might. Inside the complex, Callan's team moved with practiced efficiency. They planted charges along key structural points, their actions methodical despite the chaos erupting around them. The Empire's soldiers were well-trained, but they were unprepared for an attack of this scale, their coordination faltering under the weight of the rebels' assault. Nessa fought alongside her people, her rifle precise and unyielding. She moved like a force of nature, her every action driven by the belief that this battle mattered, that it could change something. She caught a glimpse of Marcus in the thick of the fight, his blade flashing as he cut through an enemy soldier. Dax remained by the transport, coaxing the Gatling gun to push beyond its limits, his determination a testament to the machine's importance. But the Empire was relentless. More troops poured from the depot, their reinforcements threatening to overwhelm the rebels. For every soldier they felled, another seemed to take their place. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the acrid tang of blood. "Callan," Nessa barked into her comm. "How much longer?" "Almost done," Callan's voice crackled back. "2 more charges, and we're clear." "Make it quick," Nessa replied. "We're running out of time." The Gatling gun faltered briefly, its barrels glowing red-hot. Dax cursed, frantically adjusting its mechanisms. "Come on, old girl," he muttered. "Just a little longer?" The tide of the battle shifted as Callan's team completed their task. The charges detonated in a series of deafening explosions, the ground shaking as the depot's walls crumbled. Flames erupted from within, consuming the Empire's supplies and equipment in a hellish inferno. "Fall back!" Nessa shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The rebels retreated, their movements coordinated despite the urgency. The transport roared to life, the Gatling gun firing sporadically to cover their escape. As they sped away, the depot collapsed behind them, its once imposing structure reduced to smoldering ruins. The rebels cheered, their voices hoarse but triumphant. It was a victory, hard-fought and hard-won. Nessa allowed herself a small smile, her heart pounding with adrenaline. They had struck a blow against the Empire, a blow that would be felt. But as the transport disappeared into the horizon, she knew the battle was far from over. The Empire would come for them with renewed vengeance. But for now, they had given the galaxy a reason to hope, a reason to believe that resistance was not futile. And that, Nessa thought, was worth everything.